The guest chair has been brought back into the equation, and Kalyn Kahler from The Athletic is with us. Kalyn, good to see you. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Craig. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. You wrote a tremendous story on the San Francisco 49ers, and it's really, like, it is about the 49ers because that's where Kyle is now, but it's on, I would say, a tradition that Mike Shanahan started, one that passed through Washington, and I guess the word that we're looking for here is a surveillance state, essentially, that they've got. Well, how did you catch wind of this before we even dive into it?
Yeah, it's actually like a totally long and convoluted story. So at the time that Mike was coaching in Denver, that was his second head coaching gig after being in Oakland. He then went to Washington, obviously, and was there for 4 years, and it was not a very successful run, but it had been written about at the time that he was using cameras. Like Mike Silver, who was at Sports Illustrated back when in the Denver days, had written about it just very in like a couple sentences. Like he'd seen the operation where in the head coach's office, in Mike's office, he had a setup, where he could unmute different cameras and listen. And so it was kind of like a control center in Mike's office. And I didn't know about that. The way I found out about this was our Jets writer, Zach Rosenblatt, wrote a story about the Jets quarterback room last year, 2022 season. The lead of the story was Robert Saleh sitting in his office, listening in on the quarterbacks meeting. After they were done with a meeting, he was just like listening to them like chit chat afterwards, and like they were still talking about football. They were still going over plays, and that was the anecdote of like, look at how hardworking this quarterback room is because they're still going over plays. But what I took away from that was like
holy
what
cow,
the hell?
How does he doing that?
I was like, that's really weird. I'm like, is this normal? This is not something I'd heard of before. So then I started texting coaches I knew around the NFL, one of whom had worked for Kyle in San Francisco, just randomly, because I was just like, okay, what coaches are going to respond to me quickly? So I'm just like, assistant coaches, whoever. Yeah. Is this normal? Are other teams set up this way? And he's like, oh, Saleh got that from Kyle in San Francisco. And I was like, oh, interesting. So then I'm like, well, where did Kyle? And then I start Googling Shanahan cameras, and then you'll see like these little sentences and other stories that pop up. So that's my long way to explain how I got the story idea. So it's basically a Shanahan tree thing. Mike started it in Denver, and the technology has completely evolved to the point now.
I was going to say, like, I imagine like an old school 1980s movie, like security guard sitting somewhere, probably falling asleep before the villain breaks in, like type of setup. And now he's probably got HD cameras with like crystal clear everything.
Well, and the difference now is that Zoom happened, right? So in 2020 with the COVID protocol, teams were limited in how many people could be in a meeting room, and they had to socially distance. And if they weren't able to do that, they had to be virtual. And so coaches who might normally pop into a meeting couldn't do that anymore. So it became a lot easier to do this type of surveillance because you were already setting up all of your meetings to be recorded on Zoom anyways. So when that happened, Kyle was already doing it in San Francisco, but they transitioned to Zoom, and now it's just made it easier for him to actually, this is the difference between Mike and Kyle. Mike couldn't join a meeting from his own office. He had to walk down the hall and open the door, which he did several times.
Right. So the opening anecdote to the story in The Athletic, which I would highly recommend anyone to read, is Mike overhearing a change that was being made. It was a protection, I think.
Yeah.
And him just running down the hall and being like, oh, hell no, we're not doing it, and this is why.
Yeah. And so there was like multiple stories of that. And on Media Night this week, I needed more stuff about Kyle because I had pre-reported all of the the Mike Shanahan stuff.
Right.
And I had gotten a few players on the phone who had played for Kyle in San Francisco, but not many. So I was like, all right, Media Night, I got to get some Niners. So I went to their third string quarterback, Brandon Allen, and I'm like, assuming that Kyle is probably more involved with quarterbacks than any other position.
Right.
I'm like, does he, like, what is this like? And he's like, oh, we call the screen in our room like the Zoom screen, he's like, we call it the voice of God because Kyle will unmute and just start talking into their meeting. So that's where the technology has changed because Mike had to physically appear. Kyle doesn't even have to leave his office. He can just unmute himself and start correcting things, which is really interesting.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about it. I feel like if I was like, I guess what it does do, like, I don't know. So I've got a lot of, the audience knows this, so I'm sorry to the audience for on some level being repetitive here, but you don't know this. So I do a podcast with Logan Paulsen, who played for Kyle.
Logan was in my story.
There you go.
Yeah.
So Logan and I talk about stuff with Kyle all the time, and I think there's like a couple of different things that I've learned about why that tree is so successful. And one of them is the level of perfection that is needed to get something in the playbook. Level of refinement is extraordinarily high, which is why I think these coaches like Slowick go to somewhere else and become very successful. Also, there is, if you're going to work for Kyle with the level of detail he has, your ego has to be in control. And I'd imagine, there are coaches that absolutely that would not fly with. And if you know that about yourself, you're probably not working for Kyle Shanahan.
Yeah, and I think that's completely right. And the thing that was interesting about this is, I have 3 things to say, but the first thing is, I'll try to remember them all. But
that's been me all week.
Yeah. The first thing is, I did speak to a few people who were very critical of this system, but I couldn't include their opinions in any concrete way in this story because they were not even willing to go anonymous. I couldn't refer to them in any capacity.
It's just I'll tell you, but you can't use it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting because it shows Kyle Shanahan is a very powerful figure. We've seen 3 different head coaches get hired from his staff. So he's got a lot of sway and people are not wanting to be on the wrong side of that. So there are people who are definitely not fans of this, but everyone that is quoted in my story is yeah, we like it because it helps the coaching messaging stay consistent.
At the end of the day, if you're about the team, he's the guy that drives it.
Right.
So it's quality control in real time.
And Logan had a really good quote and a really good point that he made in my story when I talked to him, because he played with Mike and Kyle.
Right.
So he's got the experience of knowing them both and seeing directly how Kyle took things from Mike and how they're similar. And Logan was he also played other places outside of the Shanahan tree, Chicago, I think Houston, Atlanta.
Yep.
So he said he noticed a difference right away when he was at a different organization that was not coached by a Shanahan, because he's I might be in an offensive line meeting and the message from the offensive line coach is about our run game is not lining up with the offensive coordinator, and the offensive coordinator doesn't have the knowledge to know that our first meeting went poorly. So his meeting goes bad, and then it's all of the meetings are just compiling and the level of not being on the same page. And he was at first I just thought it was a Shanahan thing, oh, they must be talking to each other all the time. And he's but now that we're talking about the cameras, he's I think it was because of that system. That wild. Means a lot.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I was going to say is going back to the surveillance aspect of it, and I think this goes a long way in why some people are fans of this system, is there is the ability to mute your audio. So on Zoom technology, the position coach, if he wants to have a real conversation with his players, or even if he's all right, we're talking about our personal lives right now, this isn't about football anymore.
Yeah, Kyle doesn't need to hear this.
Yeah, he can mute it. And Mike was very specific when he implemented this system in Denver and Washington. At the time, it wasn't Zoom, so there was a light switch or a dial that you could turn. And Mike was very specific to tell his coaches, hey, I don't want this to feel like a Big Brother thing. If you want to talk, SHIT about me, go ahead and just turn the dial off. And then Chris Forster, who is now the run game coordinator.
Yes, great coach.
He told me that there were several times in Washington where he forgot to turn the switch back on after turning it off, and Mike's assistant had to come to his office and be hey, you need to turn this back on. So so Mike did care to be I need to hear everything about football. But if it wasn't, he was all right, just do your thing. I don't want you to feel like I'm watching you every single second of the day. Right.
That is so cool. There's so many more anecdotes and so much great insight, and you get more Logan Paulsen, which, what more does my audience want than more LP?
He's great. I had never met him before.
Well, we'll have to,
big fan.
Now we have to get you on the podcast.
Yeah.
We have to get you on Take Command.
Yeah.
So we'll get that all scheduled. We have each other's email. We'll get that done. Maybe we can do a podcast length version of this and talk about some more of the anecdotes.
Yeah.
And we don't have to be radio friendly, so that's also fun.
Right.
Kalyn Kahler, you read the story in The Athletic. It's so good. Definitely check that out. When we get back here on Radio Row in Las Vegas, Scott Graham, one of the great voices of the NFL on Westwood One, joins us here on The Hoffman Show.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.